Today we talk about Sutton Scarsdale Hall, which in her heyday was second only to Chatsworth House in the county in terms of the scale and opulence of the building. What happened to this majestic shell, and why are we so fortunate that we still have what is left of her? What we see today is around the fourth or fifth incarnation of about 1,000 years worth of history. As well as a fascinating past, this grand ruin has her legends, ghosts, and even links to art and Hollywood. I am so pleased that I got to see Sutton Scarsdale Hall firsthand. She has been fenced off for quite some time, and English Heritage have reopened her from April 24, so this beautiful ruin, the bones of a once magnificent house, can be admired in almost full. There have been many inhabitants of Sutton Scarsdale over its extensive history. Here we will be focusing mainly on two families, the Leeks and the Arkwrights. The majority of the stories relate to the Leek family, who held this hall for 10 generations, or around 330 years. Attached to the hall by a wall is St Mary's Church, which in itself is Grade 2 listed and dates from between 1300 and 1400. It appears to have been rebuilt between the 14th and 15th centuries. Unfortunately, I couldn't get inside to look at the interior of the church. However, it apparently contains monuments to the families living at Sutton Scarsdale Hall. The graveyard does contain graves which date back to the 17th century, and I did notice some belonging to the Arkwright family while I was visiting. The land a long time ago belonged to the Saxon lord Wulfric Spot. He founded the Benedictine Abbey on the banks of the River Trent at Burton, and when he died in 1002, the manor was given to the monks of Burton-on-Trent Abbey. When William the Conqueror invaded in 1066, the manor was given to a knight of his, Roger de Poitou, the listed owner in the Domesday Book. The first house was erected in the 13th century under the Sutton family, and by 1489 the Leek family had possession of the house. The house was brought up to date in 1594. The house that we see today is a Georgian home in a Baroque style, which was intended to reflect the status of the family which owned the hall. It was built mainly between 1724 and 1729 for Nicholas Leek, the fourth and last Earl of Scarsdale. He died a bachelor and a bankrupt in 1736. He commissioned the place to be rebuilt using parts of the existing structure, so some parts of the current ruin are older than 1724. The current structure is built incorporating the hall built for Sir Francis Leek in 1594-5, which was enlarged in the early 17th century. The house existing immediately prior to this one was already one of the larger ones in the county, being taxed on 26 hearths in 1670. The fourth Earl only employed the best architects, builders, craftsmen and Italian plasterers, and no expense was spared. In the video description I will include a list of constructors for the hall, and perhaps a few other details if I can squeeze them in. Sutton Scarsdale was the masterwork of Warwick-based architect Sir Francis Smith, the same architect who worked on Derby Cathedral. The building reflected the Earl of Scarsdale's determination to leave his mark at Sutton. Although he knew the house would have to be sold to pay his debts, he continued adding to it. After the Earl of Scarsdale's death in 1736, the house was owned by the Clarks between 1740 and 1824, who completed the rebuilding. There were large, grand fireplaces made from marble and inlaid with blue john. Blue john is a fluorite which is specific to the Derbyshire area and mined in Castleton's Treak Cliff Cavern. There were grand carved mahogany staircases. The rooms were adorned with full-height Corinthian plasters and the carved insignia of the Earl of Scarsdale. Most rooms were wood-panelled, but some were given beautiful stucco plasterwork decoration by the famous Italian stuccoists Arturi and Francis Vassali. There are tiny fragments of this left today inside the ruin, which are quite difficult to film as this area is still caged in. The external columns and balustrades ran all the way around the roofline. The grounds the house is built on were also stunning. The house overlooks the Vale of Scarsdale. It was built on raised ground and enjoyed sweeping views across its deer park towards Bolsover Castle. In the 18th century, avenues of elm trees were created by the gardener John Christian, along with ornamental ponds, and a deer house gave shelter to a herd in the park. Some buildings which were once attached to the estate are still in existence and are now in private ownership. They are situated amongst the modern housing around the hall. These include an ice house, stables, a brew house built in the 16th century, and an octagonal walled garden built in 1745, which was converted into kennels and now exists as a separate house called the Old Priory. Upon the 4th Earl of Scarsdale's death, the house and the estate were sold to offset the enormous debts accrued from the rebuilding work on the house. The debt amounted to around £91,000. There were a number of owners before the estate was bought by the Arkwrights, who held possession of the hall between 1824 and 1919. Richard Arkwright Jr. bought the hall in 1824. His son Robert inherited in the 1830s. Richard Arkwright Jr. was the son of Richard Arkwright of Cromford Mill, inventor of the spinning jenny and known as the richest commoner in England. In 1824, when the Arkwrights purchased Sutton Scarsdale Hall, Henry Bramwell is recorded as accidentally drowning when he fell backwards into the water trough at the hall. The scale of the estate and the Arkwrights' wealth required a large staff. Some 20 servants worked in the house alone. Richard gave Sutton to his son Robert in the 1830s. On his death it passed to his son, the Reverend Godfrey Harry Arkwright, and then on to his eldest son, Francis Arkwright, in 1866. Francis migrated to New Zealand in 1882, so he left Sutton Scarsdale Hall in the care of his cousin William Arkwright, who then inherited the property when Francis died in 1915. The hall suffered some neglect under William Arkwright's care, and it seems that the hall was left largely unoccupied after Francis's emigration in 1882. The hall was put up for auction in 1919, but the market for large homes was in decline and the property did not sell. The 5,000-acre park surrounding it did, to which William retained the mineral rights, but the house itself did not. This is a little sad. It's great that it all didn't end up in a skip or something, but still, it's not in its original home and I would have liked to have seen the beautiful interiors myself. What about the stuff which we don't know where it's gone? What happened to that? But to continue, in 1920, Robert's descendant, William, sold the estate to a speculator, Haslam Limited, who slowly began to asset strip the house, selling its contents and fixtures, such as fireplaces, panelling, staircases, and even the roof. The roof was stripped of lead, the ornate ceilings designed by the Italian craftsmen were removed to take out the wooden joists, and some of the stone was used to build houses in the Summersall and Brampton areas. In 1946, the shell that remained was due for demolition and was only saved at the 11th hour by the writer Sir Osbert Sitwell of Renshaw Hall. Sir Osbert turned out to be a decent bloke. He found the building the night before its demolition, whereby the brickwork would have been salvaged, and bought it there and then with a view to restoring it to its former magnificence. Sadly, this ambition was never realised. Sir Osbert Sitwell died in 1969. In 1970, his descendants persuaded the Department of the Environment to take the building into guardianship and preserve it for the nation. In 1971, emergency repairs were started in order to protect the building from further decay, and Grade 1 listed status had been granted to Sutton Scarsdale Hall in 1951. When the fixtures of the building were put up for auction, some of the oak panelling was sold to newspaper baron William Randolph Hearst, who planned to use it in Hearst Castle. But that never happened. It sat in storage in New York for a number of years. It was eventually acquired by Pall Mall Films and was used as a stage set for Kitty in 1945, which was nominated for an Oscar for Best Art Direction, Interior Decoration. The panelling was afterwards given to the Huntington Library and Art Gallery in California. 3 other rooms are in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Although the interiors have been altered in reconstruction, they still give a fair representation of how they must have appeared originally. Alongside fixtures from the room of Sutton Scarsdale Hall being used in a film set, another link is that Sutton Scarsdale Hall was used as inspiration for the abandoned Wayne Manor in the 2016 film Batman vs Superman. Other artistic links are that Nicholas Leake, the 4th Earl of Scarsdale, is potentially the inspiration for the character of the Rake in Hogarth's The Rake's Progress. The Rake declines and ends up in Bedlam. The moral of the tale being that, for idle hearts and hands and minds, the devil finds work to do. William Arkwright's marriage was impacted by a hunting accident where he fell from a horse and was left paralysed with a metal plate in his skull. His relationship with his wife was potentially the inspiration for Clifford and Constance Chatterley's relationship in D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover. However, Sutton Scarsdale Hall is not the inspiration for Rugby Hall. There are stories and legends associated with Sutton Scarsdale Hall and some of its occupants. There have been quite a number of Sir Francis Leakes, but here we are referring to the one who was born in 1626 and became Baron d'Eyncourt and the first Earl of Scarsdale. He was a committed royalist during the English Civil War, and in 1643 he defended Sutton Scarsdale against a siege by 500 parliamentarian soldiers who had 2 cannons. He resisted for a length of time, needing to bury his dead in the grounds. However, the house was eventually stormed and taken. Sir Francis had to pay £4,000 to prevent the destruction of his home, plus he was made a prisoner of war and had to report to Sir John Gell, Cromwell's parliamentary commandant of Derbyshire. After the war, a fine was paid of £18,000 for Francis Leake's support of the king during the Civil War, and this was paid by Francis's friends. When Cromwell's men moved on to take their next royalist house, Sir Francis fled to Newark, and while there he entertained King Charles I from August through to November, becoming an ally. This succeeded in buying the king's favour, who created him Earl of Scarsdale. Sir Francis was in Newark when the town was under siege, and he marched out at the head of the troops when the town surrendered. Perhaps somewhat strangely in his grief, after King Charles I was executed in 1649, Sir Francis had a grave dug for himself in the churchyard next to Sutton Scarsdale Hall, and every Friday evening he would dress in sackcloth and ashes and go and lie in the open grave in prayer and meditation in remembrance of his dearly departed king. Another potential provocation to haunting at Sutton Scarsdale is the rumour that when the Arkwrights moved in, Robert had the remains of the Leake family removed from their resting places in the family crypt next door to assert his ownership of the hall and bury his own family members there instead. I would be interested to know where they were moved to, and whether anyone knows if there have been any cases in the area of skeletons being recovered in unexpected places. Another tale associated with Sutton Scarsdale Hall is that of Sir Nicholas Leake and his plight when he went off to fight in the Crusades. With elements of romance and perhaps foresight, Sir Nicholas cut his wedding ring in half with his sword and gave one half to his beloved wife before leaving, and kept the other for himself for remembrance, fidelity, and good fortune. He was captured during the fighting and incarcerated for many years in terrible conditions. He was pining to be returned to his beloved home and wife. He prayed to the Virgin Mary that this might happen, even if it was only in a dream, and he made the promise that if he was granted his wish, he would feed the poor of the parish. To his astonishment, when he awoke, he found himself on the doorstep of the church next door to his beloved home. He went to the door of Sutton Scarsdale Hall and demanded to be let in. However, due to the harsh conditions he had been living in and his dirty, unkempt appearance, the servants did not recognise him and refused. He then presented them with his half of his wedding ring and bid them to take this upstairs to his wife. She then realised that this was truly her husband returning, and they were reunited. So what happened next? Well, Sir Nicholas Leake needed to uphold his promise to God that he would feed the poor of the parish. He ordered that on every St. Nicholas's Day, which is the 6th of December, his servants would bake a dole of loaves and distribute these to the poor of Sutton, Duckmanton and Temple Normanton. It increased to around 18 and 20 loads of wheat baked, and each loaf weighed around 2.5 pounds. This act was to continue forever and only ceased to be practised with the death of the fourth and last Earl of Scarsdale. Each loaf was marked with the letter N, thus demonstrating to God that he, Nicholas Leake, was fulfilling his promise. On one occasion, one of Sir Nicholas's descendants forgot to meet this obligation, and the day after St. Nicholas's Day, a well between the hall and the church overflowed and did a considerable amount of damage. The heir ordered that the loaves be baked and distributed immediately, and the flooding subsided as quickly as it had occurred. At this point, I would like to interject that alongside the fanciful nature of this return, whilst quietly pondering whether it may have been a crisis apparition, there are other issues with this tale. Chronologically, it doesn't fully work. The first leak was in residence at Sutton Scarsdale Hall in 1432. The Crusades were largely over by around 1291. However, there were still some Crusades occurring around the Ottoman Empire in the mid-15th century. So although the likelihood reduces, I suppose there is still a sliver of possibility that the leaks at Scarsdale may have been involved with the Crusades. The Leakes who were heading up Sutton Scarsdale Hall around this time were mainly John Leakes, with the first Nicholas appearing around 1655. Could the story have related to a brother of the head of the family? This becomes less likely with the subject creating the order for the bread to be made and distributed. This sounds like it would have come from the head of a household. A lot of legends contain some element of truth, even if it is just a snippet, which becomes distorted over time. I wonder if the story might have related to another Leake. Sir John Leake the Younger, for example, who presided over the hall in 1505, married Jane Foljambe and went to fight with King Henry in France. Could the story be linked to him and have become muddled? Or Sir Nicholas Leake, the 4th Earl of Scarsdale, was committed to the Tower due to him supporting the Jacobite uprising. He was discharged in 1716 and spent the remainder of his life rebuilding Sutton Scarsdale. However, this would be too late in the day as the giving of the bread tradition died with him, and he dies a bachelor, so how did he return to his wife? I'm going to leave this here. If learned historians haven't got to the bottom of this, then my chances of doing so in this video are slim to none. But I do like this romantic little tale of love and devotion, and I don't want to completely let go of it and dismiss it as nonsense, despite the discrepancies. It is rumoured that the ghost of Sir Nicholas Leake has been seen in the church next door. People have reported a grey figure wandering the graveyard towards the church. He is also thought to haunt the porch of the church and to roam the grounds, which may explain the sightings of shadows or feelings of being followed. I did also hear that a male spirit is supposed to walk through the blocked-up door at the side of St Mary's Church. Could this also be Sir Nicholas Leake? A dog, on his walk across the churchyard, had his fur stand on end, and then bolted to the door of the hall, and then ran sniffing at the door of the church. Was he detecting the ghost of the returning Nicholas Leake? The cellar is currently inaccessible, being locked and gated in. It is, as you can imagine, an extensive cellar and probably appropriately spooky, as much paranormal activity seems to belong there. Fortunately, I am able to share with you what the cellar looks like thanks to the kindness of John Orme, who has graciously allowed me to use his photographs. John Orme runs a Facebook group on Sutton Scarsdale Hall, and I am very fortunate to have found it. John has also shared with me an experience which he had while he was in the cellar at Sutton Scarsdale Hall. This was the sound of very loud, clear and distinct knocking, what he referred to as the knocking ghost. He has no idea where the sounds came from, and he was all alone at Sutton Scarsdale at the time. There was snow on the ground, and there were no footprints in the snow to indicate the presence of a living being which could have made the knocking sounds. There have been similar reports by labourers who were working on restoring the site. One was alone in the cellar and heard footsteps cross the ceiling, then thud down the stairs. Again he was alone on site, and there was no one there when he flung the door open to check the other side. On another occasion, workers gathered around the stove to warm themselves whilst in the cellar, when they heard voices coming from behind the door at the bottom of the steps. Once again, there was no one there when the door was opened. On yet another occasion, labourers took a friendly cat down to the cellar on a freezing day, hoping to provide it with some warmth. However, the cat reacted wildly when it got into the cellar, hissing and clawing and scratching, desperate to escape. There have also been reports of dark shadows moving around in there. Another thing to note about the cellars is that there are rumoured to be tunnels running from it to the woodland. It is also rumoured that a dark deed may have occurred in one of those tunnels. I have seen it said on social media sites that there are indeed tunnels running from the cellars, and that people have seen that the entrances of them are covered up with paving slabs. There are those that say that the tunnels are not very long, however others counter, but where did the tunnels go before they were filled in? Could they have been used by the monks of Burton-on-Trent Priory to make a concealed and speedy exit when enemies came to the building? Is this why the ghost of a monk has been reported in nearby woodland? There have also been reports that the ghost of a little girl who died in the cellar still haunts there. To add an even more sinister note to this, the apparition of a dismembered hand has also been cited as appearing at the entrance to the cellar steps and beckoning and luring people, apparently to accompany it into the dark, dank space. I have been in contact with paranormal group Paranormal Hauntings, who have also graciously allowed me to share an image of theirs and their experience during an investigation which they did at Sutton Scarsdale Hall in April 2020. They captured the pictured image, which does appear to be the shape and figure of a woman in a long dress. They reported in an article for Derbyshire Live that their paranormal equipment began to go off almost immediately, and they sensed a presence, and 2 team members who live in separate homes both unexpectedly fell ill with stomachache, which led to the investigation ending prematurely. They were live streaming the investigation on Facebook, and the audience were stating they could see a woman in the room with them and were sending screenshots to the group. The spirit is believed to be that of a lady whose husband went off to war and did not return. Could this be one of the ladies of the hall or one of the staff who worked there? I found another reported sighting of a woman haunting the hall, and I wonder if it is the same lady. In the 1970s, a man and his son were walking up the main driveway away from the house. They turned back to look at the hall and saw a woman tearfully waving in their direction from a window upstairs. Of course, there are no longer any floors or ceilings in the house anymore for a lady to stand on the upper floor. Other events which are reported regularly are the pervasive smell of tobacco smoke on occasion, when there is no one smoking and when everything is open to the elements and there aren't any rooms to speak of to contain the smoke. Dog walkers have also reported strange floating lights moving amongst the ruins. Alongside these, the sound of footsteps, cold spots and the sound of screams have been reported. Historian Richard Felix has spoken of his own experience at Sutton Scarsdale when he was participating in a BBC Radio Derby broadcast. In his own words from the book The Ghost Tour of Great Britain, Derbyshire, "We arrived at the front of the hall and tried to get a signal to enable us to do a live satellite link back to the radio station's base in Derby, but just as we were about to broadcast, the signal disappeared. Thinking very quickly, we instead attempted to dial the studio from a mobile phone, but again we couldn't find a signal. Undeterred, we drove around to the other side of the building, but the same thing happened. We put up the transmitter mast but couldn't get a signal. Strangely, however, as we drove away just 100 yards from the hall, we received a call on the mobile from BBC Radio Derby asking what had happened. Yet another reported apparition is that of a lady in white. In the 1960s, a man and his son reported seeing the ghost early one morning between the Church of St Mary and the hall. She was seen gliding through the churchyard without legs, her eyes were slits, she wore a hood and cried or sobbed. The Reverend Stanley Hare of the church also said it flies through the bushes and makes very weird noises at night and could very well frighten anybody. Was it an owl? One final note on the ghosts of Sutton Scarsdale Hall is this image here. This is an image on a postcard dating back to 1905, which appears to show some labourers at Sutton Scarsdale Hall. The postcard is owned by and found on the site of paranormalinvestigators.co.uk. One of the figures looks rather more ghostly than the others. Is it too good to be true? The result of movement or too long an exposure time, perhaps? Should you wish to visit Sutton Scarsdale Hall, it is free to have a wander round. There are no facilities on site and I didn't notice any pubs on my way into the village you could nip into, so I would go to the loo before you go. It is looked after by English Heritage and it does have set opening hours of 10 till 6 in summer and 10 till 4 in winter, and I would imagine that there is some overnight monitoring. I went during the school holidays and it was not really busy. Visiting this place has made me really want to get a drone, so if you have one, maybe take it with you.